Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Greenlight Bookstore on Flatbush Avenue.
Thank you.
I'm Josie here at Greenlight, and we are so excited to be hosting tonight's event with Daisy Pitkin presenting her new book, On the Line, a story of class, solidarity, and two women's epic fight to build a union. She'll be talking with David Hill, so you're in for an excellent evening. Before I turn things over to them, just a couple of housekeeping reminders. First, if you could please silence your cell phones, and please wear a mask for the entirety of your time in the store this evening. We're also recording tonight's event, so if all turns out well, we'll be sharing it on our social media channels in the next few days. And most importantly, don't forget to buy the book. If you purchased a book bundle with your ticket, thank you so much. If you haven't already grabbed it, we'll get it to you at the register before the evening's over. We also have signed copies for sale at the registers tonight. Daisy will personalize books by request after the presentation. Your purchase of On the Line and other books here in the store make it possible for Greenlight to continue to offer accessible event programming, so we thank you for helping make this bookstore sustainable. Now on to the good stuff. Our interviewer for this evening is David Hill, author of The Vapors, A Southern Family, The New York Mob, and the Rise and Fall of Hot Springs, America's Forgotten Capital of Vice, which we have signed and for sale at the registers tonight. He's also the host of the Spotify original podcast, Gamblers. David is the Vice President of the National Writers Union and a former union organizer. He'll be speaking with our featured author tonight, Daisy Pitkin. Daisy has spent more than 20 years as a community and union organizer, working first in support of garment workers around the world, and then for U.S. labor unions organizing industrial laundry workers. Her essays have been awarded the Montana Prize, the Disquiet Literary Prize, the New Millennium Award, and the Monique Wittig Writers Scholarship. She grew up in rural Ohio and received an MFA from the University of Arizona. Pitkin lives and writes in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she works as an organizer with an offshoot of the Union Unite. Daisy's new book, On the Line, takes readers inside a bold 5-year campaign to bring a union to the dangerous industrial landscape laundry factories of Phoenix, Arizona. Pitkin looks back to uncover the forgotten roles immigrant women have played in U.S. labor movement and points the way forward. As we experience one of the largest labor upheavals in decades, On the Line shows how difficult it is to bring about social change and why we can't afford to stop trying. So you're in for something really special tonight. Daisy will briefly be reading from the book, and then David will join her in conversation, and you'll have the chance to ask questions after that. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Daisy and David.
Should I talk into a microphone? Is it important for the recording? Does anyone know?
Yeah.
Should I talk into a microphone?
It doesn't matter.
Okay. Okay, doesn't matter. I'm going to read just a short passage from the book. And it's the part I'm going to read is from the first chapter. And it's a scene where I, as a young kind of new union organizer, meet one of the most important characters in the book for the first time. Her name's Alma, and she was a worker leader at her factory during an organizing campaign there. And she helped to organize that factory, but then also other factories across Phoenix. And she's one of the gutsiest people I've ever met. And the book sort of is a portrait of her and written kind of in honor of her and the work that she did. And so this is the scene where I meet her for the first time. You were our first contact at that laundry because your husband was the cousin of the shop steward at the one union laundry in Phoenix, Mission Linen. I knocked on your door with Manuel a few days into the preparation work we were doing. It was one of the first times I'd been on a union house call. I sat on the olive couch in your living room, looking at a photograph of a teenager in a black cowboy hat, which rested on a small shelf among candles and dried flowers. I didn't know yet that he was Julio Martin, that he was your son. You worked in soil sort, you said. I asked if you would describe your work. I still had no idea what soil sort was or what you were required to do with your body there for 10 hours a day. You rose from your chair to demonstrate, maybe because you could tell by how poorly I'd asked the question that I didn't speak much Spanish, and maybe because laundry work is difficult to explain without miming the motions of the massive machines that fill the factory. When you stood up, I was surprised by how tall you are, which I hadn't noticed when you greeted us at your door. You showed us how huge bags of linen, up to 300 pounds, you said, are pushed off the backs of trucks in rolling carts. The carts are pushed into a dumper machine, which, like a garbage truck, picks them up with metal arms and turns them over in the air. You reached up to show us how the linen is supposed to fall on the soil belt. A person is stationed there who is also called a dumper. On your shift, that person is Santiago, you said. You bent forward to show us how he tugs open the bags of soiled hospital laundry with his thinly gloved hands. You showed how he pulls each bag's mass of sheets and gowns and towels apart. You said, the company doesn't replace the gloves every day, so we have to rinse and reuse the ones they give us. Sometimes the gloves break open and we have to keep using them anyway. You said this in Spanish, after turning to me and saying, sorry, no English, in English. And I, in return, waved my hands awkwardly, I imagine, and said, no, don't worry, in English, which Manuel then had to interpret. The linen moves down the belt, you said, and then you flipped your arms back and forth to demonstrate how you and the other sorters toss sheets to one bin, towels to another, gowns to a third, and so on. You said, sometimes there are syringes and scalpels, sometimes body parts wrapped in the linens. You said, sometimes they speed up the conveyor, and we don't have time to be careful. There is a lot of blood and puke and feces. You said, we don't get shoe covers, so some of us take off our shoes and drive home in our socks. You said, our gloves are too big. They slip off our hands. Sometimes when they tear open, we have to handle the soiled linen with exposed skin. Manuel was a more experienced organizer and had his own gestures for explaining things. The union, for example, he symbolized with a fist. Spread apart, our fingers can be broken, he said, but squeezed together, his fingers clamped down and hooked under by his thumb, we are stronger. You nodded. Your grandfather had been part of the land struggles in Mexico. Your father led copper mine strikes in Sonora. You said, I know what it means to fight.
Thanks. That was really nice. I'm not going to use the microphone. Did everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. So Daisy, first of all, thank you for writing this book. It was, it's a beautiful book. It's one of the most, accurate portrayals, I think, of what that world was like, if, being sort of an organizer during that period of time in the labor movement. And what I mean by that is that you and I were kind of both a part of, we were like the last wave of this generation of organizers that came into the labor movement through this program called the Organizing Institute. And I say the last wave because it started in, I think, 91. It ended around the time that the events of this book were happening. And when I try to tell people about that time in my life, they don't believe me, you know what I mean? Or it's hard to convey to them what it was really like. It's something that I think people think I'm exaggerating. And for people here who maybe haven't read the book, I wonder if you could just share a little bit or talk about what that life was like as being kind of an organizer during that period of time in the labor movement, sort of, roaming the earth with flip charts and
It was crazy. Yeah. The organizing work that we did, and you could talk about this as well, I know. I mean, we were living in motel rooms. We were put on these kind of flying squads that would travel around and organize in the industries that we were in charge of organizing. And living in motels, sometimes renting offices where we would paper the room with wall charts where we were trying to track what was going on inside places that we were aiming to help workers organize. But often the places that we were organizing were big facilities that operated 24 hours a day, right? So a lot of the organizing happened overnight, shift meetings at 2 o'clock in the morning and then again at 3:30 and then again at 6 a.m. So we weren't sleeping, we were not healthy. We were just working really frenetically. I try to explain it to people, it feels like you're strapped to the front of a freight train once a campaign is in the open. And there's a lot about that in the book. There's this sort of secret underground phase of organizing, but then once the organizing is in the open and the employer knows about it, the intensity of the campaign just continues to build because workers are literally, they are engaged in a struggle inside their workplace, and it's your job to support them in that. And it feels incredibly important, because it is. It's important work. And I think we were sort of steeped in the importance of that and the mythology of the union and its kind of own importance. And at least the team that I was on, and I wonder if it was the same for you, it felt as though there wasn't room in life to be doing anything outside the work of organizing on the campaign, right? And we were committed to it in that exact kind of way.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like that period of my life, which was like, you know, from when I was like 20 till, I don't know, I mean, like for a good solid, all of my 20s, you know, and most of my 30s, I feel like I just was gone. You know what I mean? I lost all my friendships that I had before. I was disconnected from my family because I just sort of lived in this world. And part of what I think what we see in your book that was a motivator there was that you're side by side in these sort of small towns across America with these workers who are going through this incredibly difficult thing, and there's this feeling, right, that you need to be there with them every single day and every minute of it.
Yeah.
You know, you can't like, go home and take a day off or whatever until the fight's over.
And part of it, I think, and this is something that I think about a lot in the writing of the book, and therefore the book sort of thinks about it a lot, that there's a power dynamic inherent in that relationship between paid staff organizer and workers undergoing a fight inside their workplace to form a union. And that is that, you know, for me it was an exhausting endeavor. It was a difficult endeavor. But we were paid to do that work. We were not taking on any of the risk involved in what it means for workers to stand up to their employer. Often it's certainly in the case of industrial laundries, you don't work that job unless you have to, right? It's not like people could, at that time, and now we're in a moment of the Great Resignation, things are the dynamics are a little bit different, but it's not as if many of those workers could afford to lose that job. They were taking on a lot of risk. I was taking on no risk, and inherent in that was a lot of responsibility to them, or I felt, or maybe we felt. That was sort of the culture of the union that we were working in at that time, I think.
Right. And that union was Unite, and you know, I think the word that people often described Unite with back in those days was scrappy. It was a small, you know, garment workers union that did a lot of organizing around the country. Can you talk a little bit about like when you first came to work as an organizer? Was it, you know, what your sort of perception was, and were you surprised by what that organization and that life was kind of like?
I think, you know, when I was an undergraduate in college, I did work with the Student Labor Action Coalition, which is sort of aligned with USAS, and was really focused on doing anti-sweatshop work. I learned a lot about organizing during that time, and a lot about like power and the way it works. Like, as students, we had some power in that situation. We were the ones who were going to buy college apparel or not, right? We were the ones who were going to stand up and say, we need to monitor the factories in which this is made. So I was really involved in that kind of work, which was good work. It's important work. It felt more indirect than the work of working with a group of workers to organize a union. And when I was a senior in undergraduate school, I went to McAllister in the Twin Cities, and a group of hotel workers had just organized a union at a Holiday Inn Express. And the day after they won their union election, their employer called the INS and had 7 of the housekeepers arrested, right? And the community just rose up. It was kind of amazing. The rest of the employees in the hotel went on strike, and then the community just rose up. I almost dropped out of college at that point because I was helping to organize picket lines and rallies and food cooking shifts and things like that. And the intensity of that kind of, the feeling that's inherent in watching a community and a group of workers stand up together was something that changed me. It changed like who I was and what I wanted to do in the world. And suddenly the kind of indirectness of sweatshop work, while I believe it's really important, it felt more like I needed to be doing this other kind of work, this work that was more directly involved with forming unions. So when I went to work for Unite, that's what I thought union organizing was. Like the feeling of marching down the street with 300 people, chanting, the feeling of like holding a candlelight vigil in front of a hotel where they had just fired some workers, you know, that kind of more cinematic, that like highlights reel kind of. I mean, it was hard work to organize all of that, but what I really wanted was to be close to that feeling. And then when I started working on industrial laundry campaigns in Phoenix, what I figured out is that union organizing work mostly is like boring, repetitive tasks of like making the wall charts and updating the wall charts and copying the leaflets and driving in circles around. Like, it's the very hard, grinding work of building a union from scratch.
Yeah, not only that, I feel like one of the things that we see in the book is that that intensity didn't just come, I mean, the work wasn't just the sort of rote tasks that were involved, but that those like cinematic moments are replaced by a different type of intensity, which is that part of your job was to meet every single person that worked in a laundry and go into their homes and sit with them, have them tell you their entire life story, and really build a relationship with all these people in a place that you've never been to, speaking a language you didn't speak. And that sort of intensity is, you know, maybe talk a little bit about what the organizing model was and how that model itself kind of lended itself to this sort of constant feeling of like, you know, being overwhelmed and the intensity of it all.
Our organizing model was, we were operating on the Blitz model, and that was that we would decide that we wanted to organize a work site, and in my case it was industrial laundries, and we would build a committee of workers who were committed to doing what it took, the work that it took inside their laundry to organize a union there. And we build this sort of this committee secretly, and at the same time build a list of all of the people who work in the laundry and get contact information for all of them, so that over the course of one weekend we could visit or try to talk with all of them. And in the case of Alma's factory, there were 220 workers. So it took us a couple months to build the secret committee and then to build the lists of all 220 workers and figure out how we were going to contact them. And then, you know, from Friday evening, when like the main boss in the laundry goes home for the weekend, until Monday morning, we figured that's our shot to try to talk to everyone, because even though the laundry is open and operating over the course of the weekend, at least the main managers were not going to be in that space, right? And it carves out like a little moment in which workers can maybe decide whether or not they're going to join the union, sign the union card, without their boss putting lots of pressure on them inside work, campaigning against the union immediately. But that window is so small, right? You have to really, we flew in organizers from all over the country. We flew in union laundry workers from Las Vegas and from California. We had something like 25 teams of people out doing house visits to try to visit 220 people over the course of 48 hours. And we did. Like in the case of Alma's laundry, a majority of workers signed union cards in that 48-hour period. And then on Sunday night, we held a union meeting, and over 100 people came to this general union meeting and stood there in a space with each other and looked each other in the eyes and said, we're going to do this together. No matter what they say to us, no matter what they do, we are going to form this union. And then the next morning, 7:30 in the morning, there was an anti-union consultant in the laundry. They started holding captives. They started threatening people, bribing people, surveilling people, the whole thing. You know.
Did you guys used to do that thing where at that meeting where you would walk out of the room and say, you guys talk this over and decide, and we'll be outside when you're ready?
Yes, we did that thing. Of course, we would always prep certain people to lead the conversation. And
that's like my cinematic moment, though. I feel like in the movie, if they ever make a movie about this, like that's the cold open or whatever is like that, because it's like a magical thing. And every new organizer's like, it's not going to work. They're not going to do it. You know, they're going to be too scared. And it always worked. It always worked.
What did you call that?
I don't know if we had a name for it, but it was like, what we're saying is like we would have the meeting, and then all the union staff would leave and say, it's your decision, you guys decide if you want to do this, and then everybody would sort of deliberate, and we would come and get us whenever you decide what you want to do. And you just sit outside and listen to the room, and they start chanting and cheering, and then you knew it was on, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We called that the eye to eye.
Eye to eye.
And then it was when often one of the people from the secret organizing committee, or many of them, who weren't secret anymore, everyone knew who they were, would stand up at that moment and say, like, I'm in this with you, and like look around at people's eyes, you know, are you in it with me, you know?
But this is all kind of all this stuff sort of predates the internet, I mean, the internet existed, but like,
Yeah. So I got issued a beeper when I
right.
started working.
Yeah, I don't pager and a roll of quarters. I always had a roll of quarters. But like this is like, but workers themselves, you know, in order for them to organize amongst themselves too. Like I'm bringing this up because you're an organizer today, and you're working on Starbucks, and like I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the differences between what organizing is like in America today and what it was like when, you know, when like the organizing that you describe in the book.
Well, I think there are not very many unions, none that I know of, but maybe there are some, that put the kind of resources that Unite put into organizing. I mean, it was a resource-intensive project to organize anything.
Right.
Pull together a group of organizers, fly them in somewhere, have them live in a hotel or a motel, and try to organize for years. And that's it's an expensive model. No one is doing that anymore that I know of. So as an organizer now, I'm not getting on a plane, flying around. I'm not living in motels. Mostly I'm in front of a computer. And I think that the pandemic really increased the velocity at which people learned how to do meetings over Zoom. Like the Starbucks campaign, like 90% of it is over Zoom. Like I'm organizing with workers in Eugene and Knoxville and Fort Lauderdale and Pittsburgh. I live in Pittsburgh, so in Pittsburgh I actually get to meet with people face to face, which is awesome. But most of the organizing that's happening on that campaign is over Zoom. I would not say that it's less intense somehow. It's incredibly, that campaign especially, because it's all about momentum and increasing momentum as quickly as possible, so there's a lot of intensity and intense responsibility, I think, on that campaign as well. But I'm not completely removed from any sense of a life outside the union, which is what was so different about it then. Like I had no friends after the first few months working at the union because there was no way to maintain friendships. My dad still talks about that as like the blackout period, like the time that I just like disappeared from the earth for like 7 years. I just like, they didn't know where I was.
Yep.
That's what it was like. It's not like that now.
And also ended up getting married to each other. And
I know, there were.
Because there was like...
David married an organizer.
You know, started out in hotel rooms down the hall from each other and then ended up getting married. But I want to, you know, I also think that the book has a different type of intensity that happens during this sort of trajectory that you and Alma are on. And that's that, you know, I talk about like the year 2009 as like, it's such an important year in my life for some personal reasons too, but like, I feel like we all went into 2009 feeling like it was going to be the best year ever because, you know, Obama had gotten elected president. We had, you know, we ended up winning the Senate, 60 seats in the Senate. We had the House, and we were going to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, and there were all these promises they were going to pass it, and we were going to organize 2 million workers that year. Just us, just like me and Daisy, we were going to organize 2 million workers in 2009, and we were raring to go. And then the union, instead of like sort of, you know, they didn't pass EFCA, they completely, you know, they screwed us on that, but like the union, instead of sort of meeting that moment, like went to war with itself, other unions in the labor movement went to war with themselves, and the wheels just completely came off the wagon. You talk about it a little bit in the book. I wonder if you could talk about it a little bit here tonight for folks who maybe haven't read the book about kind of what happens that makes the wheels come off the wagon.
I think there are a lot of things that happen that make the wheels come off the wagon. I think from my perspective, which is the only perspective really in the book because it's part personal narrative, and so I could only see it from my vantage point. And I think that, you know, if 10 people wrote books about what happened with the union, there would be 10 different takes on what happened with the union because we could all see it from different angles and it was such a mess, you know. But I think from my point of view, what happened was that we had a pretty severe organizing culture in Unite that I didn't know about. Even as an organizer for Unite, I couldn't see that I was inside a culture that was an organizing culture until we came into contact with another organizing culture because our union merged with another union. And then suddenly there were 2 organizing cultures and I could see that one for what it was, and then suddenly I could also see ours for what it was. And I think both of them were flawed. And in Phoenix, the organizers who came from the union that we merged with were really severe practitioners of their version of their flawed methodology. And we were pretty severe practitioners of our flawed methodology. And it was just a very difficult collision. I think part of the book is about the sort of political heartbreak that happened, maybe more generally in 2009, but also we committed our lives to building this union, and then we watched it fall apart. That's a really hard thing to think about, to write about, to try to parse. And I think when I started writing the book, I thought, it's been a long process of writing this book, but I think early on, I didn't know it was going to be a book, and I was writing this material just to try to think about what it means to be heartbroken politically. What does it even mean to have that feeling? And I didn't think that it was a feeling that was very universal or that other people were going to understand. And I think that, recent years and like the Trump years have sort of universalized a kind of political heartbreak or a brand of it. Like it's a feeling that more people have access to in some kind of way. And I hope that people can look at the book and not just think, oh, this is about some crazy thing that happened in a union, but this is about like caring about something and really believing that it's going to change the world or that it's going to make positive change in the world, and then watching it fall apart. I think a lot of people now can understand in some way what that means or what that's about.
Yeah. Well, you and I both left after that year, right? And you went on to become a writer, and you taught writing for a while. And one of the things that I say to people a lot is that I learned to be a writer when I was an organizer because I learned how to tell a story by listening to people's life stories for so long. I wonder if when you went to school and sort of learned creative writing and everything, whether you thought something similar about. Did your experience during the time you were doing this work help you at all when you were writing this book? Is not just obviously it is the substance of the book, but as a writer, creatively.
Yeah, I think organizing is storytelling, right? And we learn how to be good narrators, not just of a campaign and like a vision and a plan. We have to be constantly narrating that. But also there's sort of an interpersonal exchange that happens with every person all the time, and that's about trading stories. And then there's sort of the sort of mythos of the union itself, which gets conveyed through stories all the time. And so one of the threads in the book is about some of those early events in Unite's history, Unite being an offshoot of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So a lot of the book is also about those events that we were trained to tell stories about as organizers. And I told some of those stories so many times that it became kind of ritualistic, the telling of the story. And I got really interested while I was writing the book in the language that I had used when telling those stories. And why did I use that particular language? And what kind of shape did it give to the union that this group of workers was fighting to join? And sort of the responsibility and agency kind of twisted up and all of that.
Yeah.
But when I was doing the MFA program, I thought a lot about how the union trained me to tell stories. Or maybe I was a good organizer because I knew how to, because storytelling was sort of part of who I was. But that the two things seem so twinned in some way, that storytelling and union organizing. And I quit being a union organizer and then started trying to figure out the craft of storytelling in some way. But I didn't really want to write about unions because I was so heartbroken from it, and I didn't have enough psychic distance from it. So instead I started writing about like weird history and like moths, thinking that I wasn't writing about the union, but of course I was sort of just finding another way in.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you about the moths. People who haven't read the book may be confused about that, but there's a lot of moths in the book. It's a major theme in the book,
Yeah.
these moths. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why, what's the story with the moths, and and I thought it was kind of beautiful. It ends up being not that random and quite beautiful the way that it ends up kind of all weaving together.
Glad. For a while I wasn't quite sure if I was going to it together, you know. You have those moments when you're writing, I bet you do too, where you think, I have all these things and it makes sense to me,
Right.
but how do I make it make sense? Yeah, there are a lot of moths in the book, partly because when we started the organizing at Alma's factory, it was in the spring of 2003, and there happened to be this massive emergence of miller moths across Phoenix. So kind of an infestation of moths. And a lot of the organizing, as I said, happened sort of in the middle of the night under floodlights in a parking lot. So you can imagine moth infestation. Here we are standing under floodlights. And there were moths everywhere, and they were kind of like plinking themselves against the floodlight. So it became this sound that kind of haunted the campaign in some way, or maybe didn't haunt it, it was just sort of ambient noise that was always present. And after a while, Alma and I started calling ourselves Las Polillas, which is Spanish for the moths. And part of it was because I was reading Julia Alvarez's In the Time of the Butterflies at the motel at night, and in that book there are some sisters, the Mirabal sisters, and the Dominican Republic, who work to resist the Trujillo dictatorship, and they call themselves Las Mariposas, or the butterflies. And we started joking that we were like their ugly cousins, sort of running around in the dust of South Phoenix. So the book, when I left the Union, kind of heartbroken and not in touch with Alma, which was another form of kind of personal heartbreak that was interwoven with the political heartbreak of the Union falling apart, I started making like really strange art projects that were all about moths. Like, I won't even describe them because they were not good art, but I think I was like so set on not thinking about what happened with the Union. I was going to do art about something else, and like it was just going to be moths, and that's not at all thinking about the Union. I don't know, I had like tricked myself into thinking that it was something else. So the moths are there in the book kind of as a way to sort of explore what happened with the Union, but to do what it did for me in real life, which is to create enough kind of distance from the narrative itself that it allows some space for thinking, for reflection, I think.
Well, my favorite thing is how there's this point at which the moths kind of do intersect with the rest of the world of the rest of the human world, and that's these, what are they, how do you pronounce it, the things in France?
Magnaneries.
Magnaneries.
Yeah.
So these places in Paris where the women would care for the silkworms. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is so, this is like so vivid and it's so beautiful. But then, of course, the women end up going on strike, which was like, wow, this is incredible. How did she find this? But
the first ever uprising of industrialization was among silk workers and moth breeders. Like, yeah.
When you read that, your mind must just like, it must have been like such a
Yes.
perfect moment. This is going in the book.
Yes.
But I like this story about these women that would care for these worms, these silkworms. And they would like hold them, between their breasts and everything. And you talked about how that work, you contrasted that work with the work of like machines, right? That this was something that humans were doing with these other living things, rather than working with machines. And you talked about it being, I think you said that it was like not sentimental, that it was practical, it didn't, but it's still surrounded by mythology and fable. And to me, that felt a lot like the Union. I wonder if that was intentional. Do you think of the Union as a magnanimity?
Yeah, kind of. I think as I was writing about that kind of work, I realized that I was using language that I had also used earlier in the book to talk about union organizing. That it's sort of based on folk knowledge that gets passed down. Like, I learned from a mentor, and my mentor learned from a mentor, and he learned from a mentor, right?
Right.
So a lot of what we learned, like I still have Ernest Bennett's like sayings in my head sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
because he taught them to my organizing director, who taught them to me, and I feel like that kind of there were like rational parts about organizing, the way we did the maps and the assessments, and you had to get to 80% on cards, and then you had like there's a lot of sort of strict rules, but then there's also a lot of folk knowledge that we rely on, and that felt similar to the work of moth breeding as it happened in Lyon, France, hundreds of years ago.
The other thing that's happening is that and a lot of the reviewers of the book have sort of touched on the sort of transformations of the moths as being like sort of a representational, the transformation that the workers are going through as they form the union. But I also feel like you go through a transformation in this book too. You know, you kind of go into a chrysalis and get turned into a goop, and then you come when you get spit on the other side, you leave the labor movement. And you're back in the labor movement now, and you're organizing again. And so I wonder if you could maybe talk a little about that transformation that you went through. It doesn't sound like that experience that you had in the end made you cynical, or like maybe I ended up being, and then you came back. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own, how that experience transformed you, and how you still found yourself still here doing this work.
It was kind of an accident that I came back to the labor movement. No, not really. I certainly changed a lot over the course of the events in the book, and I continue, I think, to change all the time. But I think the thing that's most different for me about organizing now, coming back to the organizing work, is it has to do with sort of centering different kinds of emotions in the organizing work, sort of realizing that the work that we do together to build the union, even if now it's sort of like the 3 minutes before the official Zoom meeting starts and we're kind of chatting with each other, or getting together for a cup of coffee with someone, or like a lot of it happens digitally now. But even in those spaces, the work of sort of learning about each other and caring for each other seems to be more of an engine for the kinds of fights that I'm interested in having and that we're having right now in the labor movement. And that's really different, I think, from, and I wonder if this is true for you all and your team of organizers too, and how specific some of this was to the organizing that we were doing. But a lot of it was about agitation and anger and like figuring out what it was that people were mad about at work. And because I learned very specifically that anger is one of the only emotions that is strong enough to sort of get people through the fear of having to stand up to their boss. And so as long as anger was present on a campaign, that we were going to be able to sort of propel workers and guide them sort of across the finish line, winning their union, bargaining a contract. And I think that was a flaw, I think, in our organizing method. I think anger is a good place to start, but I think that the transformation stuff that comes up in the book and the way it relates to the moths is really about, like, I don't think that people continue to fight with their coworkers because they're angry. Like, they might get up and start to fight, like sign the union card because they're pissed off about how much they make, or that they don't have health insurance, or they don't have any control over their work schedules, or that they have to work with no personal protective equipment and are dealing with hospital laundry. Like anger might be the first feeling, but if it's just anger propelling a fight, it's going to burn out. And instead, what I found, even working in Phoenix and now on the campaigns that I'm working on, it's like, if by the third or fourth committee meeting, you're not like bringing food for the potluck and like the kids are in the corner doing the craft together and we have a mariachi band playing and people are like laughing together, if you're not building something new, then you're not going to get there. The anti-union campaign, all the pressure that the employer is going to bring to bear is going to fracture whatever kind of union you built because you haven't built anything that can withstand it. I feel like I think about that a lot more now in the organizing work that I'm doing.
And definitely in the book you can see that that's what you all did in Phoenix, was you built a community that sort of had its own reason to sort of stand and exist apart from the initial sort of spark, which was to organize the plan.
And that's the only reason those workers won. I mean, it took years. And I can't imagine a community of workers that didn't build that sort of mutual aid system with each other, being able to withstand what they had to go through. It just wouldn't happen if they hadn't really started to care about and trust each other in ways that were important outside of work.
Well, now you work on the Starbucks campaign, which is firing on all cylinders, and I wonder if you, which might color your answer, but do you feel optimistic about the future of the labor movement?
I do. Everyone keeps asking me that. I feel like I'm a little bit of a Pollyanna or something. I'm never the most optimistic person in the room. It's not like my go-to emotion, but I feel like something is shifting right now. And there's a groundswell that the best thing about it is that the corporations that groups of workers are fighting, and they're all different kinds of corporations. It's like service corporations, like Starbucks, retail corporations, but also, I mean, miners have been on strike in Alabama for the longest strike in that state's history. Amazon workers organizing, it's lots of different industries, lots of different regions across the country that are a part of this new groundswell. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is that employers, corporations don't quite understand like the nature of this momentum. And they're pulling from like the same old anti-union playbook that was written in like 1979. And most of it is backfiring. Like a lot of it is backfiring. One of the organizing committee members from Starbucks in Pittsburgh a few weeks ago said that, it's like Howard Schultz is facing this tidal wave. There's this wall of water rushing at him. And he's just standing there squirting at it with a squirt gun. Like he doesn't understand that most things that he's doing at this point are just sort of adding to the momentum of what's building. They don't get it.
Well,
that's why I'm optimistic.
Speaking as somebody who's very cynical, and reading your book and listening to you talk has really imbued me with this sense of optimism I haven't had in over a decade. So thank you for writing it.
Yeah.
And that's all I have. I think we're going to take some questions now. So thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? Hi.
Hi. So talking about Howard Schultz, and you mentioned earlier about having like your weekend window to organize a workplace, and at 7:30 a.m. they had like an anti-union consultant in there. What does anti-union work look like in the 21st century? Because obviously it's not, hiring the Pinkertons to come break a strike. What kind of resistance can organizers expect usually if it's a playbook that's been used since the 70s?
So they don't hire the Pinkertons, but they hire firms like Littler Mendelsohn, which Starbucks has hired, and it is a union avoidance law firm. And union avoidance, of course, has grown into like a multi-million-dollar industry. And their main job is to kind of drive corporations through these wide open loopholes in labor law so that they can delay and delay and delay and delay to try to kill the momentum of campaign, right? But they're also playing from the same old dirty tactics handbook. I mean, they've fired people, they've threatened to fire more people. In Pittsburgh, they're threatening to close stores if people organize. They've told people that they will lose the ability to transfer from store to store if they unionize, which is something that workers in that company really rely a lot on. They've told people that over the summer they're going to give raises, but only to the non-unionized stores. That the unionized stores' benefits and wages will be frozen until the end of negotiations. They've claimed that negotiations are going to be futile, that they will drag them on forever and ever, and they'll never get a contract and never win anything. So it's the same threats and tactics that have been used like since the beginning of anti-union time, which is the beginning of industrialization, which was the beginning of labor resistance, right? So they're doing all the same stuff, and that's what it looks like. It's really interesting in Starbucks because the way the company is structured, like each store is kind of its own little island, except people they don't get enough hours, so they pick up shifts at other stores sometimes. So that's one of the reasons the organizing is so organic, because people have networks, they know each other, right? But each store is sort of like its own little fiefdom under a store manager. And sometimes, like more than half the time, the store manager is someone who the workers in that store really like. They adore that person. And one of the tactics that the company is using is if workers are organizing in a store where they really like the store manager, they fire the store manager. In a lot of stores, in less than half the stores, but in some stores, there's a store manager that people really don't like, and that store manager is just sort of carrying the anti-union campaign for the company, sort of campaigning as if their life depends on it. So the anti-union campaign sort of varies from store to store because of the character of that structure, I think.
Thank you, that's fascinating.
Good.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm really excited to read your book. I have like 2 questions. I'm wondering what do you think? Why is there so much momentum around Starbucks? Why Starbucks in particular? Why not other fast food restaurants, chains? And also, I was reading about the Amazon organizing, and that several of the people on the organizing committee were like young salts, people who had gotten jobs there, like recent college grads who weren't even doing it through an organization of any kind. Like many of them just decided on their own to go do this. So I'm kind of just wondering, and I imagine at Starbucks there's many young people too like that. So kind of like reflecting back on like how you got started. I mean, I'm wondering how you see like this new generation of like Gen Z, labor activists, and kind of the similarities and differences between what they are, why they're doing what they're doing, and kind of how you got started.
I think that why Starbucks and not other fast food, I think there will be other fast food companies that learn from this organizing campaign and begin to organize, right? Chipotle is a company that's structured almost identically to Starbucks. The organizing could happen there. There's some crossover between Starbucks workers and, there are other companies that will get organized sort of in the wake of, or in the momentum of, on the wave of this organizing. I think Starbucks is careful about who they hire. They hire people because they like to create an aesthetic in their cafes, right? They're very vocal about this, about Starbucks being a third place. So they want people to have like their home and their work, and then Starbucks be this place where they come and have this kind of community. And what's on the menu then is not just coffee, it's sort of like the character or the aesthetic of the people who work there. They hire young, cool, edgy, progressive leaning people. And I think that's why, the pandemic has brought into sharp focus a lot of sort of currents that are working against Gen Z. A lot of the organizers, worker organizers on the Starbucks campaign are calling themselves Gen U, Generation Union, which I get to find really powerful and like amazing. So, okay, Gen Z, Gen U, whatever. They're like, you're going to sign us a letter of the alphabet. We're going to choose which one. It's going to be you. Thank you. But I think that, we're at a moment where people are really just fed up. And there's a really deep analysis among most of the Starbucks workers that I talk to that I'm working with about that fact. That like Starbucks has hired them because of who they are, and Starbucks is making a lot of money off of that, selling coffee, right? And there's kind of an awakening happening that I'm tired of getting paid $12 an hour. That's the starting wage at Starbucks in Pittsburgh, $12 an hour, right? If I don't get enough hours, I don't have access to health insurance. The health insurance, if I do have access to, is really expensive. Like the deductible is I just cannot pay for it. There are some other shiny benefits that they've kind of piled on top, but they're not easy to access. It depends on your scheduling. You have no control over your scheduling. Some weeks you might have 30 hours, the next week you might have 15 hours. You don't know by the end of the month if you're going to be able to pay your bills. And all working for a company that is really has hired you so they can make money off of you, right? and people are sick of it. I think this is different from when I started organizing in the early 2000s because I don't know what's changed, what's different now about it. Why is this happening now? Why didn't it happen in the early 2000s? It's like cool now to organize. It was not in 2003. It was not cool.
I mean, I don't know that you want me to answer because my answer might be less, hopeful than yours, but I like what you're saying.
You like what I'm saying a lot better?
Sure, yeah. I think we should leave this event with some hope that it's not.
Don't let David talk. I am really hopeful about it though. I think the Starbucks workers are going to win, and I think that on the heels of that win, more workers are going to start standing up. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
So I just follow up on that a little bit. What's this is more about Starbucks and less about the book, but has anybody started actually bargaining a contract, and what's the plan for that?
At Starbucks?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they've entered into negotiations at 2 of the stores in Buffalo now. They've actually gone to the table and at one of the stores in Arizona. And I mean, it looks like probably what you would imagine it looking like. I mean, right now Starbucks gives into any of the demands at the table. Like, they're not going to even enter into a tentative agreement about like just cause. They're not going to put anything on the table that's an agreement because they know it will just encourage more organizing. And their number one priority right now is to kill momentum on the campaign, right?
Right, so when you say that they're going to win, just to follow up, I mean, that's what piqued the question in my head. What are they going to win and when? Because that's one of the things that strikes me about the Amazon campaign too, is that everybody is excited as if they've won. And I even heard a quote from Chris Smalls like, "We knew that this was a marathon, not a sprint." Well, that might be right. I was beginning of OI in 93.
Uh-huh.
That might be right, it's a marathon, and he's on mile 5.
Yeah, I mean, of course it's going to be a marathon. There are 9,000 Starbucks stores. Workers have filed at 250 of them as of today. It's a tiny, tiny percentage. But, I was on a Zoom call with some of the baristas in Buffalo who've made it to the table about how to scale up from here, how we train other people. Because now we've won elections at 42 stores, I think, maybe more than that. I sometimes lose track and have to go and check the tracker. But all of that's happened very quickly. It was like the Buffalo stores went first, and now in the last 3 weeks, there are like 40 new stores. So suddenly now we have to form bargaining committees and get them, And I think the thinking at this point is, look, Starbucks is insisting on bargaining store by store. They will not form regional committees. They won't allow for regional bargaining. They won't allow for national bargaining for now, right? They're not allowing for it. So fine. Every time we meet, our committee's just going to grow. So now we have on our bargaining committee 1 person from each of the Buffalo stores, and we're going to have 1 person or 2 people from each of the stores that wins their union election. So the company will say, okay, we're bargaining the Elmwood Buffalo contract today. And they're going to get on the Zoom. They also won't bargain in person. They're going to get on the Zoom and they're going to see people from 40 stores. And then they'll set dates to bargain for the store in Mesa, and they'll get on. It's going to be the same group, like 80 people from 40 stores. And that number will just continue to grow because the workers are going to insist on bargaining nationally. But if they want to set dates for the 2 stores in Buffalo plus 4 stores in Pittsburgh, at a certain point, they're paying $500 an hour for Littler Mendelsohn lawyers. They send 3 of them to the negotiations. If they want to do that times 600, at some point the shareholders are going to be like, this cannot continue. There will be a tipping point at some point.
And the flip side is true too, which is that when you described before in Unite how it was this resource-intensive model where we would sort of fill up hotels with staff and it would cost a lot of money to do that. What you're doing now, really there's not anybody staying in a hotel in all these little towns.
That's right.
And so you can't. They're not going to be able to break the union, right? The union's capacity to continue these campaigns is kind of unlimited since it's just workers who are doing it all
Yeah.
around the country, and that's an advantage on the union side.
That's an advantage on the union side. And, there's this partner who's worked for Starbucks for 15 years. They call themselves partners, right? Because Starbucks calls them partners, and they sort of decided to take on that language as like, you want us to be partners? We're going to be partners. So one of the partners from a Buffalo store who's a 15-year employee of Starbucks, her name's Michelle Eisen, and she's going to just lead the bargaining nationally. She's phenomenal. She said on the Zoom call a couple days ago, in the words of Chris Small, we are going to build the table and they are going to come to it. That's what's happening now. Like, we're just going to continue to build this bargaining table. Pretty soon we're going to have like 700 people on our bargaining committee. And like at some point, they're not going to be able to hold 700 different bargaining sessions with their littler attorneys. They're going to come to the table. They're going to say, let's do this nationally. We need to have a deal.
And that's also true for Amazon workers in the ALU, is that there's not a bunch of paid staff, and it's not like it's a resource-intensive model there either.
And it's also good, one of the old anti-union tactics is to third-party the union.
Right.
To talk to workers about how the union is this outside force coming in to disrupt this family that we have here in this workplace between the bosses and the workers, and those bad union thug bully organizers coming in. And it doesn't make any sense to workers on the campaign, because that's not really what it looks like. They're like a handful of organizers working on the campaign. It's workers organizing themselves and then each other, and that's spreading like wildfire. That's what the campaign looks like. They can't stop that. Right.
Hey, just to say one thing before asking the question, there is fast food organizing outside of Starbucks, and I'm part of it, that it's 5 to 15. And it's got a flawed model too. It's a top-down sort of organizing model. It's different from what's happening at Starbucks and different from what's happening at Amazon, but check out the 5 to 15.org. Because, and we're potentially on the verge of a breakthrough in California where the workers will get a seat to negotiate terms of employment in California. Potentially, not work, right? But you mentioned both the Starbucks organizing and then the ALU, the Amazon organizing, right? And I was sort of surprised to hear you draw the commonalities, right? Because Chris Mullin and Derek Palmer and the ALU they said we're not going to join with a major union. We're going to be completely independent, right? Mm-hmm. And Starbucks is under the umbrella of our old friends that were both part of the Workers United. And now I'm hearing you talk about it. It does sound actually like there's more in common than I would have thought. But can you talk a bit about that, like the differences and the commonalities between Amazon, where the official union effort in Alabama got very close, and we know what's going to happen there. Chris Mullin and Derek Palmer in Staten Island chose a different road. They're not affiliating with the major union, and they really rejected a lot about the traditional labor movement part of. And then Starbucks, which is sort of maybe somewhere in between.
I think so. I've read reporting about the Amazon campaign, so I know how it's been characterized in that way. But I didn't work on that campaign, so I don't know the inner workings of it. So in broad strokes, what I think is similar about them is that they are worker-led grassroots campaigns. And what I find most interesting and sometimes also challenging about the Starbucks campaign is that the workers themselves, mostly centered in Buffalo, but now also there are workers who are at early unionizing stores in Boston, in Arizona, in the Pacific Northwest now Pittsburgh, who have formed this kind of national committee of workers, and sort of these ad hoc committees that take on work for the campaign. And they themselves are insisting that this not be a staff-heavy campaign. So every once in a while, Workers United, the union that I work for, comes in and we're like, listen, we've got to scale up, we need to hire a bunch of organizers and put them on the campaign. And the workers themselves are like, no, we don't want you to hire a bunch of organizers, we've got this, we're going to do it. so there's this interesting kind of play about, they are being logistically supported and in terms of resources in some degree, and there are some organizers and there are really good lawyers and strategic thinkers on the campaign, but it's not the same kind of structure that Unite took on in terms of top heaviness, right? It's not that at all, and purposefully not that. And so that seems to me to be the main similarity, that the workers themselves are taking on almost all of the work of organizing. Even the sort of, I don't know, sometimes as an organizer in the old Unite, I would think the workers, when they're in an organizing fight, their job is to talk to each other and hang on tight and make sure that the support is there and that they're able to resist, they're able to withstand the anti-union campaign that the boss is putting them through, and that's what they're going to do. And my job as an organizer is to do all the other stuff. Like, I'll plan the meetings, I'll get all the supplies, I will make the copies, I'll do all that stuff. And pretended in some ways, or thought in some ways, that was not a center of power. That those were logistical things and that they didn't have anything to do with strategy, but of course they did. I was steering the campaign in some ways by doing even those sort of boring, mundane pieces of the work, right? And on the Starbucks campaign, very purposefully, organizers are not, all of the logistics, all of the communications, all of that, it's all being done by the workers themselves, and that's what's different about it. I feel like I'm not being terribly articulate, but I hope you.
Sounds pretty clear to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, I think one of the unspoken, some of the things I think that are almost, that are less spoken about and are just underlying the book, that I wonder about reflecting on what's so different, right? Is that this is Arizona in 2003, right? You're talking, Right to Work read Joseph Arpaio's Arizona, undocumented, I'm curious about how we should think of, how we think about some of these dynamics about now, right? Where the Starbucks workforce, again, based on being hired by who they are English speaking, a whole different, there's a whole set of resources and privilege, attached there. But just, one of the things I was thinking about when I was, rethinking about the book, what was accomplished, actually, in the organizing that you read out in the book was staggering, right? And it's almost unsaid in the book, right? How many laundries were organized in Phoenix, right? The most anti-union place you could possibly imagine. And a workforce that is, I'm thinking about how we resource organizing in the parts of the economy that are invisible and the workforces that are invisible, right? The factors that let you create a campaign against Starbucks, and the factors that let you create a campaign, not just in an undocumented workforce, not just in Arizona, but in an industrial laundry, which literally nobody in the world could identify or explain, right? Are really different, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that's really powerful about the book is kind of digging in there, and is a spot where, in thinking about what's different now and what are the optimisms and not, a lot of the power of what's happening now is happening in a really different workforce that, may or may not touch the folks that, were in Arizona. And I don't know, so just, you're reflecting a lot on that, even though the book doesn't, immigration is there in the book, but it's not the top of the book. The countervailing forces in that space are so enormous, and the things that were overcome are so enormous. And I don't even exactly know what my questions are, but those are sort of the things that I'm reflecting on.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, because it's almost it's the understory.
Yeah, I think this difference that you're pointing to in terms of Starbucks workers sort of collectively, the sort of skills and access that they can bring to the campaign, as opposed to the group of industrial laundry workers who we were organizing with in Phoenix, who had sort of vulnerabilities and intersections of vulnerabilities that were at play, especially in deep red city, deep red state, Joe Arpaio country, where people were literally roaming sheriff's posses were roaming the streets looking for brown people who may be undocumented, asking for their papers, arresting them. I mean, it was like an overtly hostile place for that group of workers, right? And this is something we being the labor movement, ought to think about moving forward. It's not just like Starbucks workers are organizing themselves and each other, and we should expect that to be able to happen in industry after industry after industry, right? A lot, like earlier tonight I was at dinner and got a text message from a Starbucks worker at a store where we haven't talked to anyone yet in Pittsburgh. So a brand new store, got a text message, and it said, "Hi, I'm not going to say his name. We have formed an organizing committee. I have created a spreadsheet of all of the workers in the store. We have given assessments to each of the workers," because they've learned from other workers in Pittsburgh that these are the first steps. Like, don't even come to the union until you have the spreadsheet, all of the names, the phone numbers, the shifts, and what the gut assessment is about how people might vote for the union. And you formed an organizing committee that can talk to all of those people in 4 days. Like, that's the model. Has it all in place, but there's a certain set of skills that come, like knowing how to open up a spreadsheet and do it, and then he had already set up a Zoom link. Can you Zoom with us at this time? Here's a link. There's a certain set of logistical skills that many of the Starbucks workers bring to the table, which is why it's available to them to organize themselves and each other in this sort of wildfire kind of way. Part of my job also working for Workers United in Phoenix is being the internal organizer for the industrial laundries where we represent workers. There are 3 unionized laundries in Pittsburgh. We have some amazing committee members there, shop stewards, who know their contract inside and out, know how to file a grievance. Like, when they spot a safety hazard in the laundry, will organize a delegation of people to go, they're powerful. It's a powerful union shop, right? The best shop steward at the laundry, his name's Curtis, freaking amazing. He doesn't know how to make a spreadsheet, It's just not a skill that he has learned or that has been taught or mentored to him. And we have to think about that. How do we democratize the skills as quickly as possible to workers who may not come all ready to the union fight, knowing how to make a spreadsheet and set up a Zoom link and all of that stuff? If we're going to organize workers outside of a particular set of workers and continue with this wildfire model, those kinds of skills have to be taught immediately and very quickly, so that those workers can run their own campaigns, organize themselves and each other, which is what we're seeing in Amazon and Starbucks, and we'll continue to see in other kinds of workplaces, I think. But otherwise we'll end up with a 2-tiered labor movement, The one that's growing really rapidly among workers who already have those skills, and one that's not growing very rapidly. Because unions aren't resourcing campaigns like the way we used to in Tucson. And it would take that kind of resourcing unless something changes. Yeah.
I think that's it. That's all the time we have.
Can we give it up one more time for Daisy and David? Thank you both for such a fantastic conversation tonight. We've got a few minutes left here in the store. Both their books are available for purchase up at the registers, and we'll see you again soon.